Welcome back, my friends. Tonight, keep your eyes on the dark. Not every warning comes as a scream. Sometimes it comes as a silence that arrives too suddenly, as a shadow where nothing should be standing, as a sound outside the glass, soft enough to make you wonder if you imagined it. And sometimes, by the time you understand what was watching, it has already chosen you. Act 1: The Lie. I used to guide winter hunts in the north. I want you to hear that clearly, because it's the last true thing I'll say without flinching. For 19 years I took men into country where the cold could kill you between one breath and the next, and I brought them home. Bankers who'd never field-dressed anything larger than a steak. Oil money from Calgary. A senator once, who wept the first time he heard wolves, and then lied about it on the flight out. I knew the land the way you know a face you've loved a long time. Every scar, every mood, the way it went quiet before it turned on you. I thought knowing the land was the same as being safe in it. That's the first thing the preserve took from me. Not my eye. That came later, and the eye was almost a mercy compared to what they took first, which was the simple, stupid faith that I understood where I was. What happened in Red Antler Preserve was not a hunt. It was a judgment, and I was found guilty along with the rest of them, because I saw everything coming and I said nothing. And the snow remembers a coward the way it remembers a body. It covers him slowly, and it does not let him go. Let me tell it the way it happened. From the beginning. From the lie. The job came to me in October, through a fixer named Carl who handled bookings for people who didn't want their names on things. That should have been the first warning. I'd worked clean my whole career, but the lodge was 3 seasons behind on the mortgage. My knee had started telling me how many years I had left, and Carl said the word that he knew would do the work for him. He said the number. $40,000. For 2 weeks of guiding a wildlife photography and research expedition into the back country. Cash, half up front. A man named Victor Hale was funding it. Old timber and shipping money out of Vancouver. And the expedition had all the right paperwork. Federal research exemption. University affiliation. A wildlife survey permit for a restricted ecological zone that I'd flown the edges of 100 times and never once been allowed to set foot in. Red Antler Preserve. Even saying it now, my mouth goes dry. You won't find much about it online, and what you find is wrong. Officially, it's a protected migratory corridor and magnetic anomaly study area for 1,000 square kilometers of black spruce and frozen muskeg and granite the glaciers forgot to finish. Off-limits to civilians. Off-limits to aircraft below a certain ceiling. The kind of blank space on a map that makes people assume there's nothing there. There's something there. The old trappers had a name for the place before the government drew its lines, and the name didn't translate to anything you'd want printed on a brochure. My grandfather, who ran a line up near there until the year I was born, used to say only one thing about it. He'd say, "We don't go where the white birds nest, because the white birds are watching for us." I thought it was the kind of thing old men said to keep boys from wandering off and freezing. I was wrong about that too. I met the clients at the staging lodge on a Tuesday, with the first hard snow already down and the lake skinned over with new ice. 11 of us, all told, counting me and my crew. I remember standing in the mud room watching them stamp off the cold, and I remember the exact moment I understood that I'd taken money to lie. It was the cases. A photography expedition has a particular look to its gear. Big padded cases, sure, long lenses are delicate, and they cost more than my truck. But these men carried their cases the wrong way. You learn to read weight in a man's shoulders, and the weight in those shoulders was wrong for glass. It was the dense, balanced weight of something machined and oiled. The way a man carries a rifle case is different from the way he carries anything else, because some animal part of him knows what's inside and treats it with a kind of respect. I saw it in the first 10 seconds, and I poured myself a coffee, and I said nothing. That's the sin. I want to be precise about it, because precision is the only honesty I have left. It wasn't that I didn't know. I knew. I knew the way you know a sound is your own roof beam cracking, and you tell yourself it's the wind. I told myself it was the wind for 2 weeks, and 11 of us paid for it, and only 4 of us came back, and not one of the 4 came back whole. Let me tell you who they were. You should know them. The forest knew all of them by the end, knew them down to the lies inside their blood. Victor Hale was the leader, the money, the will of the thing. Late 50s, silver at the temples, the kind of handsome that money sands smooth. He'd hunted everything legal, and most things that weren't. There were photos on his phone he showed around the fire that should have put him in prison on 3 continents. He had a trophy room, he said, a private one, climate-controlled, and there was one wall left empty in it. He'd flown to the edge of the world to fill that wall. Dean Walker was his shooter. Professional. Quiet in the way that's actually loud, if you know how to listen. He'd done contract work I didn't ask about, and he handled the disguised cases like they were children. Dean is the one who pulled the trigger that started everything. Dean is the lucky one. Dean died first, fast, in the crash, and I have envied him every single night since. Grant Mercer was ex-military, and he wore it like a coat he refused to take off indoors. Big, loud, certain. The kind of man who believes the world is a problem and force is the answer, and the only question is how much. His leg broke in the crash. The cold and the dirt and the time took the rest of it. By the end he was a man arguing with a forest that had already won, and the forest let him argue, because the forest had patience and he did not. Marissa Vale was the doctor. She'd been brought along for the obvious reason. You don't take 11 people into country like that without someone who can sew. She was cold and clean and brilliant, and she'd come for the money and the discretion, and she was, in the end, the bravest of all of us, which the tribe understood, and which is why what they took from her was the thing she used to save people. Darren Pike was the cameraman. He knew the trip was a lie before any of us, and it thrilled him. He wasn't filming wildlife. He was filming an illegal hunt for the most dangerous trophy on Earth, and somewhere in his head he was already cutting the footage, already hearing the numbers, already famous. He turned sacred things into content. The forest had a specific answer for that, and the answer was that he would never see anything again. Sabrina Cole came for the same reason as Darren, but louder. An influencer, millions of followers, a face built for the front-facing camera, a way of talking that made everything around her into a backdrop for herself. She treated the most dangerous wilderness on the continent like a luxury experience she'd booked. The last thing I have of her is a sound, and I'll come to it, and I have never been able to unhear it. Neil Foster was the forger, the fake researcher. He'd built the paper that got us through the gate, invented studies, invented affiliations, a whole career of lies dense enough to fool a federal office. He'd never spent a night outdoors in his life. His punishment, when it came, was the most quiet and the most patient and the most terrible, and it was about blood, because the tribe believed his blood was full of lies and wanted to let it out slowly so the lies could drain. Owen Krill was my mechanic and equipment man, and I'd worked with him 8 years, and bringing him on that trip is a thing I'll answer for when I die. He was good and decent, and he could fix anything with wire and patience. After the crash, he tried to fix the radio. Later, he tried to hide a tool, so we could cut our way out. The forest doesn't like a man who tries to fix his way out of a judgment. What they did to Owen, I had to listen to. We all did. That was the point. Liam Cross was my assistant guide, 24 years old, and he was the only one of us who was close to innocent. He'd taken the job because I'd offered it, and he trusted me. He looked at me the way I used to look at my grandfather. He was the heart of us in the cold, when everything else was rotting, and the forest took the heart of us, and it did not even do it cruelly, which was somehow worse. I'll tell you about Liam. I'll tell you all of it. He deserves at least that. And the pilot, Everett Shaw, bush flyer, 20,000 hours, a man who'd put a plane down on a postage stamp in a whiteout and laughed about it after. Victor bought him. That's the simple truth. Victor showed him a number 2, and Everett took it, and Everett flew us where no one is allowed to fly, and Everett died for it on the first night with his ribs through his lung, whispering apologies to a wife I never met. 11 of us. I told you 4 came back. Let me tell you how the other 7 were judged. Act 2, Forbidden Airspace. We staged for 4 days while the weather decided what it wanted. I ran the clients through cold protocols they pretended to listen to, watched Grant try to one-up Dean on the rifle range that didn't officially exist, watched Sabrina film herself in front of the sunset with the lake behind her like the country was a set she'd rented. On the 3rd night, by the stove, Victor finally told me what we were after. He thought he was rewarding me with the truth. He had the look of a man sharing a secret he was proud of. "You ever hear of the Bloodcrest?" he said. The fire popped. Liam looked up. Owen kept oiling a bearing and pretended not to. I had heard of it. Of course I had. Up here you hear everything eventually, sitting in cabins through nights that last 16 hours. The Bloodcrest was a story, the way the Wendigo is a story, the way the lights in the sky used to be the dead dancing. A white bird, they said, big as a goose but built like a falcon. White as fresh snow except for the tips of every feather, which were red, so that when it spread its wings it looked like it had flown through blood and come out the other side. A crown of crimson on its head. And eyes, the old men always lingered on the eyes, gold. Solid gold, no pupil you could find, like 2 coins set in a face. They said it sang before storms. They said when it called, the whole forest went silent, every other bird, every animal, the wind itself, as if the world were holding its breath to listen. They said it was the eye of God, and that God watched the forest through it, and that the sky above where it nested belonged to it, and to nothing else. They said you don't hunt it. They said hunting it is the one thing the land will not forgive. I told Victor it was a folktale, a trick of light on a snowy owl, maybe the kind of thing that grows in the retelling. He smiled at me like I was a child who still believed in maps. I've seen a photograph, he said. A real one. Cost me more than this whole expedition. He turned his phone toward me, and I'll be honest, my stomach dropped. Because whatever was in that photo wasn't an owl. It was perched on a black branch against white sky, and it was exactly what the old men described, down to the gold of the eyes, and the eyes were looking straight into the camera in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. Not the blank stare of a bird. Something behind it. Something taking note. That wall in my trophy room, Victor said. That's whose wall it is. I should have walked out into the snow right then, and kept walking. $40,000 and a dying lodge held me to the chair. I told myself, again, it was the wind. The 4th morning broke clear and brutal, -30 with no wind, the kind of cold that makes the air ring like glass. Everett had the de Havilland Beaver fueled and warm. We loaded in the dark, 11 people in gear into a plane built for far fewer, but Everett had stripped and balanced her, and he flew like the air was an extension of his own nerves. Before we boarded, he pulled me aside. You know the airspace over the inner preserve's closed, he said. Not a question. I knew. Hard ceiling. No civilian aircraft below 4,000 feet over the central zone, and a wide no-fly heart in the middle of it where you weren't supposed to be at any altitude. The official reasons were on every chart. Severe microclimate turbulence, a magnetic anomaly that played hell with instruments, and a protected migratory concentration, so dense that aircraft had reportedly gone down from bird strikes back in the 70s. Reasonable. Bureaucratic. The kind of reasons that make you nod and rout around. Victor wants me to take her low over the heart of it, Everett said. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the plane. Says that's where the bird is. Says he'll double what he already paid if I drop her down to treetop on a slow pass, so his shooter can get a clean look. And you said no, I said. He didn't answer for a long moment. The cold ticked in the metal. I've got a daughter starting university, he finally said, and that was the answer, and we both knew it, and neither of us said anything else, because there was nothing else to say. We were all bought. The whole expedition was a chain of men who'd each been shown a number. We climbed in. Everett ran his checks. Behind me, Dean opened one of the disguised cases for the first time without bothering to hide it anymore, and I watched in the little mirror as he assembled a rifle with a long barrel and a heavy scope, slow and loving, and I said nothing, and we lifted off the ice into a sky so clear and blue it looked like something you could break. For the first hour, it was the most beautiful flying I've ever done. The preserve opened beneath us like a country out of an older world. No roads, no cut lines, no towers, just black spruce running to every horizon, broken by white muskeg and frozen rivers that caught the sun and threw it back like cracks in a mirror. No sign that a human being had ever passed through. I'd flown the north my whole life, and I'd never seen anything so completely untouched. It did something to the back of my neck. A held-breath feeling, the feeling of being somewhere you have not been invited. Then we crossed into the heart of it, and the world began, very quietly, to go wrong. The first thing was the radio. We'd had a steady wash of static and the occasional far-off voice all morning. There's always something, a distant tower, another bush flight, the ambient murmur of the modern world. As we crossed into the no-fly heart, that murmur thinned. Then it stopped. Not into silence, into a kind of dead, padded hush, the sound a radio makes when there is genuinely nothing anywhere to receive. Everett tapped it, frowned, said nothing. The second thing was the compass. I was watching it because watching instruments is a habit older than my conscious mind. The needle, which should have sat steady, began to wander. Not spin, wander. It drifted off our heading by 10 degrees, drifted back, drifted the other way, slow and aimless, like a thing trying to point at something that kept moving. The backup behaved the same. Everett switched to flying by the sun and the land, his jaw tight, and he caught my eye, and I knew he was thinking about the magnetic anomaly on the chart and trying very hard to keep thinking only about that. The third thing was the worst, and I almost didn't notice it because it was an absence. The sky emptied. We'd been flying through scattered birds all morning, ravens, ptarmigan flushing off the snow, the occasional gerfalcon. Normal. Alive. And then, crossing some invisible line, there was nothing. No birds. No tracks below that I could see. The land just stopped having anything in it. Mile after mile of perfect, dead, white silence, and the only moving thing in all that country was us, a single droning machine where nothing was supposed to be. I felt watched. I want to be clear that this wasn't a feeling I reasoned my way into. It arrived whole, the way pain arrives, with no argument. Every animal instinct I'd spent 19 years sharpening was screaming the same single word, and the word was leave. "Victor," I said into the headset. "We need to turn around. The instruments are gone. The weather can flip in here without warning, and there's something wrong with this air. I'm calling it." We turned back. There was a pause. Then Dean's voice, flat and quiet, over all of us. "There." I followed his eyes down and to the left, and I saw it. A single white shape, perched on the dead crown of a lightning-killed spruce that stood above the rest of the canopy. From 300 feet up, it should have been nothing, a speck, a trick. But it held the eye the way a wound holds the eye. White against white, and yet completely distinct, because of the red. The tips of the wings. The crown. And though I could not possibly have seen its eyes from that distance, I would swear before any court that I saw them turn up toward the plain. That I felt them. 2 points of gold tilting up to watch us pass, calm, unsurprised, the way you'd watch a fly cross a room you owned. The Bloodcrest. The whole plane went quiet. Even Sabrina, who narrated her own life without pause, said nothing. Victor leaned forward between the seats, and his face, I'll never forget his face, was the face of a man looking at the only thing he had ever truly wanted. "Take her down," Victor said to Everett. "Slow pass. Now." "No," I said. "Everett." "Triple," Victor said. "I will pay you triple today, before we land, and there is nothing in those rules about a low pass except a fine I will pay for you with my coffee money. Take her down." And Everett, who had a daughter starting university, dropped the nose. We came down out of the safe altitude in a long, slow spiral, and the canopy rose up toward us until the individual trees had texture, until I could see the snow lying in the crooks of the branches. Everett leveled off low and slow, throttled back as far as he dared, the engine note dropping to a heavy patient drone, and we ran a line that would take us 100 feet to the side of the dead spruce and the white bird waiting on it. Dean had his window open. The cold came in like a blade. He had the rifle up, braced, his cheek welded to the stock, and he was breathing the slow, controlled breaths of a man who has done this 1,000 times, and the bird sat on its branch and did not move and watched us come. I have asked myself 100 times why the bird didn't fly. Every other living thing for miles had cleared out of that air. And this one creature, the rarest and most hunted thing in the world, sat in plain sight and let an armed plane drift into range. And I think now that I know the answer, and the answer is the most frightening part of the whole story. It wasn't trapped. It wasn't unaware. It was waiting, the way bait waits, the way a judge waits for the defendant to do the thing that proves the verdict. "Don't," I said. One word. To no one. To everyone. Dean fired. The shot inside the cabin was a flat, enormous slap, and through the window I saw the white shape jerk on its branch, saw a small explosion of red. And here is the thing I can't get past. I could not tell if the red was blood, or if it was simply the feathers, the red tips flaring out as the bird snapped its wings open, because they were the same color, they were exactly the same color, as though the creature had been designed, so that wounding it and merely seeing it would look the same to a guilty man. The Bloodcrest dropped off the branch, and then it called. I had heard the old men describe the call. I had not believed a sound could do what they said. It came up through the floor of the plane, through my boots, through the bones of my legs, not loud the way the rifle was loud, but total, a single descending cry that filled the entire sky from edge to edge and left no room in it for anything else. The engine seemed to vanish under it. My own heartbeat vanished under it. For one impossible second the whole world was that one falling note, and every hair on my body stood up, and I understood, in a way that had nothing to do with thinking, that we had just done something that could not be taken back. The note ended, and the silence after it lasted exactly 1 second. Then the sky answered. I have tried for a long time to describe what came up out of the forest, and language keeps failing me, so I'll just tell you what I saw, and you can do the rest. The trees, for miles in every direction, lifted. That's what it looked like, as if the white snow caught in every branch of every tree in that dead country had decided, all at once, to rise. The canopy blurred and bloomed upward in a single motion, and the blur was birds. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, white-bodied and red-tipped, every one of them a Bloodcrest, rising in a column that turned the blue sky white and then turned it dark, because there were so many that they blotted the sun. I had been wrong about the empty sky. The sky hadn't been empty. The sky had been holding still. And now it moved, all of it, and it moved toward us. Everett swore and slammed the throttle forward and hauled back on the yoke, and the Beaver clawed for altitude, engine screaming, and for 1 second I thought we might outclimb it. We did not outclimb it. The flock hit us like surf hits a swimmer. The first impacts were single heavy thuds, whump, whump, bodies striking the wings, the struts, the fuselage. Then it became a roar, a continuous battering rain of flesh and bone against aluminum, and the windshield filled with white and red, with wings and open beaks and gold eyes, with bodies striking the glass and bursting and smearing it red so that Everett was suddenly flying blind. They came into the open window. Dean screamed. I heard him scream, the professional, the quiet man, screaming as they tore at him, and the cabin filled with feathers and the smell of blood, and the deafening, furious sound of thousands of wings in a space built for none. The engine note changed. I will never forget the way the engine note changed. It went from a scream to a stutter to a sick, wet grinding as the propeller took body after body into itself, and then it simply stopped, and in the half-second of relative quiet before the rest, I heard Everett say, very calmly, the way good pilots say it, "We're going in." Act 3, the crash. I don't remember the impact. That's a mercy the body gives you. There's the engine dying, and Everett's calm voice, and the white and red chaos at the windshield. And then there's a gap, a clean black gap with nothing in it, and then there's the cold. The cold is what brought me back. It was in my mouth. I was looking at snow from very close, snow packed against the side of my face, and I could feel it melting into my skin, and the melting hurt, and the hurt was the first thing that was mine again. I was hanging in my harness. The plane had come down hard through the canopy. The trees had taken the worst of it, snapping under us, slowing us, and that's the only reason any of us lived at all. And it lay broken and tilted in a tangle of shattered spruce with one wing gone entirely, and the cabin twisted open to the sky. Snow was already drifting in through the gaps. It was very, very quiet. Then the quiet started to come apart into sounds. Someone was moaning low and steady. Someone else was saying a name over and over, Sabrina, 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 which was Darren, I realized, Darren the cameraman, who even then had somehow gotten his camera up and was filming, the little red light steady in the wreckage. Owen was already moving, already pulling at jammed buckles with his big, careful hands, saying, okay, we're okay, which was the most generous lie any of us would tell in that place. I got myself loose and fell the short distance to what had been a wall and was now a floor, and I started counting heads, because that's the job, that has always been the job. Count your people. Dean was the first I found, and Dean was the first I knew was gone. He'd been half out the window when we hit. I won't dwell on it. He was where the front of the plane had folded, and the birds had been at him before that, and there was no question and nothing to be done. And here is the detail that I think about, the detail I think the forest left for me to find. Caught in the blood that had frozen on the shattered windshield, pressed into it like a fingerprint, were 3 red feathers. And lying in the snow just beyond the wreck perfectly composed, not torn, not crushed, lay a single white bird with red-tipped wings and a crown of crimson and two open golden eyes. The Bloodcrest, Dean's bird, Dean's trophy. It had fallen exactly where he had, and the two of them lay a few feet apart in the snow, the hunter and the thing he'd hunted, and I understood without being told that nothing about that was an accident. The bird had not died randomly in the chaos. It had come down here, with him on purpose, to be found beside him. The first arrangement. The first sentence in a language I didn't yet know I was being made to read. Everett was alive, but he was dying, and we all knew it, including him. The yolk had come back into his chest. Marissa got to him first. She'd come through with a broken nose and a gash on her scalp, but otherwise whole. And she did the cold, competent things a doctor does. And then she met my eyes over his body and gave a small shake of her head, and I understood that all the competent things were just kindness now. "Ribs through the lung," she said quietly to me, not to him. "He's drowning. Hours. Maybe through the night if he's strong. There's nothing here." Everett heard. Of course he heard. He looked up at me with blood at the corners of his mouth, and he tried to say something, and what he got out, over the course of the next hour, in pieces, between the wet, awful sounds of his breathing, was a daughter's name and the word sorry. And that's how the bush pilot Everett Shaw spent the strength he had left. Apologizing, to all of us, to none of us, to a girl starting university who would never learn how her father died. He went sometime in the deep middle of the night, while the rest of us pretended to sleep, so we wouldn't have to listen. In the morning the snow had covered him to the chin, and his face above the snow was perfectly calm, and I thought, he got off easy. I would think that about more of them before the end. I would come to think of a fast, clean death as the thing to envy. We took stock when the light came up gray and grudging. 11 had left. Now there were 9 of us alive, and the country we were alive in did not care whether we stayed that way. Dean was dead. Everett was dead. Grant's right leg was broken below the knee. A bad break, the kind where the bone has its own ideas about which direction to point, and Marissa said it as best she could with a strut off the wing and torn jacket lining, and Grant, to his credit, made almost no sound, just gripped Owen's wrist hard enough to bruise and breathed through his teeth and called the forest a series of names. The radio was destroyed. Owen spent an hour with it anyway, because that was who Owen was, and at the end of the hour he set it down very gently, the way you set down something you've decided is dead, and said the emergency beacon was gone too, sheared off with the tail, and that no one knew we were here because no one was supposed to be here, because Victor had wanted no one to know. That landed on all of us. Victor had bought our isolation along with everything else. We had flown into the one part of the continent where no search would ever come, because there was officially nothing to search for, and we'd told the world we were somewhere else entirely. We were as alone as it is possible for human beings to be. Or we should have been. We were not alone. We learned it that second night, and we learned it slowly, which I think was deliberate. It started with the dogs. Not howling. I knew howling. I'd guided through wolf country my whole life, and a wolf's howl is a clean, lonely sound that belongs to the dark. This was different. This was closer, and it was wrong, a thick guttural panting, many throats, moving in the trees just past the edge of where our one salvaged lamp threw its light. It would come from the left. Then it would be gone. Then it would come from behind us, where nothing could have circled to without crossing open snow we'd have seen it cross. It moved like it knew exactly where the edge of our light was, and enjoyed staying just past it. Liam found me in the dark and stood close, the way he had as a boy on his first hunts, and he whispered, "Caleb, there's something out there." "Wolves," I said. "No," he said. And he was right, and we both knew it, and I hated him a little for being right because it made it real. Then Sabrina, who'd been filming the Treeline with her phone's night mode the way she filmed everything, made a small sound, and held the screen out to me with a hand that had started to shake, and on the screen, rendered in the sick green of digital night, I saw them. Figures, standing among the trees, not moving, spaced out around our camp in a wide ring, more of them than I could quickly count, tall and still and silent, and on their heads. I didn't understand it at first, my mind kept trying to make it into branches. On their heads were antlers. Real antlers, fixed somehow to hoods or helms, so that against the trees they read as part of the forest, as deadfall, as nothing, until you knew to look, and then you could not stop seeing them. They had been there for a long time. That was the thing that emptied me out. The dogs and the panting had been a courtesy. The figures had been standing in the dark watching us grieve and argue and set a broken leg, watching us be human and frightened and small, for hours, maybe since the crash, and they had simply waited until we noticed them, because being noticed was the next thing they wanted to happen. Grant, even with his shattered leg, started shouting at them, the soldier's instinct, "Show yourselves, who's there?" And his voice went out into the trees, and the trees ate it and gave back nothing. Then one of the figures raised something to its mouth, and there was a low note, not the bird's call, a human note, a horn or a bone flute, 3 rising tones, and the whole ring of them stepped forward into the edge of the light at once. That's the last clear thing I remember of that night. The smoke came after, something thrown into our fire that bloomed up thick and sweet and wrong, and the light smeared, and my legs stopped listening to me, and the figures came in through the smoke with the dogs low and silent at their knees, and I went down into the snow with my face turned up toward a sky that had, for one moment before the smoke took my sight, gone white again with wings. Act 4, The Prison. I woke to the smell of wood smoke and animal and old blood, and to the sound of slow dripping water, and to a cold so deep it had stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like a weight. I was lying on packed earth and pine boughs in a low structure built of split timber, the gaps chinked with moss and frozen mud, a roof of poles and hide above me. A cell. There's no other word. A heavy door of lashed timber, a small high opening for air, no other way out that I could find with the frantic hands of a man just waking into a nightmare. Through the high opening came gray light and the sounds of a settlement, voices in a language I'd never heard, the creak of something wooden swinging, the scrape of a sled, dogs. I was not alone in the cell. As my eyes came up, I found Liam against the far wall, awake, watching me, his young face gone old overnight. And Owen, and Marissa kneeling over Grant, who was gray and sweating and silent in a way that frightened me more than his shouting had. The others, Victor, Darren, Sabrina, Neil, were in other cells, I'd learn, scattered around the prison yard, so that we couldn't plan, couldn't comfort each other, could only call out and be heard, which the tribe wanted, because being heard was part of it. "Where are we?" I said, and my voice came out wrong. "I don't know," Liam said. "They carried us. A long way. There were sleds." "The dogs," he stopped. "Caleb, the dogs aren't dogs. Not all the way. They're too big and their eyes are wrong and they don't bark, they just watch you and breathe." I got up and went to the door and looked through the gaps in the timber, and I saw the place they'd brought us, and I want to describe it carefully, because I think the design of it was the first thing they wanted us to understand. It was a settlement, but no settlement I'd ever seen or read about. It sat in a hollow ring by black spruce so dense and tall it made its own dusk, and everything in it was built of 3 materials: wood, hide, and bone. There was a wide central yard of packed snow, and it was fenced, not with a simple palisade but with timber sharpened to points and lashed at angles, and woven through the timber, fixed to it, hung from it, were bones. Animal bones mostly, I told myself. Long bones and ribs and the great curved jaws of things, white and yellow against the dark wood, so many of them that the wind moving through made the whole fence murmur and clack, a constant low rattle, the sound the place made instead of silence. At intervals around the yard, driven into the snow and standing taller than a man, were antlers. Not on figures now, on their own, set into the ground, painted or stained a deep dark red along the tines, dozens of them, a forest of red antlers ringing the place, and I understood the name then, and understood that the name had never been about a color of stone or a kind of tree. Red Antler. The antlers were the boundary. They marked the edge of the world that belonged to them. There were structures around the yard, the timber prisons like ours, and low-domed huts that breathed smoke from their crowns, and a raised platform of poles from which hung a cage, a human-sized cage of bent and lashed wood, swinging slightly empty. And there were pits, covered pits, their wooden lids weighted with stones, and I didn't know yet what the pits were for, and I would have given my remaining years not to learn. And at the head of the yard, raised on a mound, sheltered under a great hide canopy, was the shrine. It was made of feathers, red feathers, thousands of them, layered and woven and fixed to a frame of antler and bone into a shape that was not quite a bird and not quite a face and not quite an eye, but suggested all 3 depending on how the light moved on it, so that it seemed to shift and breathe and watch. Before it, the snow was stained dark in a wide fan, old stain, layer on layer, years of it. And set into the center of the shrine, mounted with terrible care, surrounded by offerings, was a single white bird with red-tipped wings and a crown of crimson and two golden eyes. Not Dean's bird, an older one, the one before. And I understood that there had been others before us, that this had happened before, that we were not the first to fly where we should not fly and shoot what we should not shoot, and that the shrine was a record, and that somewhere in that yard a place was already being prepared to record us. The figures moved through it all without hurry. Tall people, wrapped in layered hide and fur, their faces marked with ash and red ochre in patterns I couldn't read, antler-crowned calm. They didn't look at ourselves with hatred. That's what undid me. There was no hatred in them at all. They looked at us the way you'd look at livestock that had done something. Not angry, just certain, just patiently sure of what came next. And among them, watching us, stood a man who was different from the others. He was shorter, paler under the ash, and when our eyes met through the gaps in the timber, his face did something none of theirs had done. It flinched. His name was Elias Ward, and he came to our cell that first evening with a tribesman at his shoulder and a bowl in his hands, and he was the first human voice we'd heard that we could understand, and the sound of English in that place nearly broke all of us at once. "Don't crowd the door," he said, low and fast, before any of us could speak. "Don't shout. They're watching how you behave, and it matters. It matters more than you understand right now." He passed the bowl through the gap, a thin broth, warm, smelling of fat and something bitter. "Drink that. It's safe. The bitter is just bark. It'll keep the cold sickness off you." "Who are you?" Marissa said. Steady even then. "What is this place?" Elias looked over his shoulder at the tribesman, who stood impassive, who clearly didn't understand English, and Elias's whole body relaxed half a degree, and that's when I understood he was as much a prisoner of this place as we were, just an older one, a tamer one, a man who'd been here so long the cage had grown into him. "My name's Elias," he said. "I came in 9 years ago. Different expedition. Different reason. I'm the only one who lived, and I lived because I was useful. I had a knack for the language, and they need someone who can speak to the ones they catch, because a judgment doesn't mean anything if the judge don't understand it." He looked at each of us in turn, and his eyes were the eyes of a man delivering news he'd delivered before and hated delivering. "So I'm going to tell you the truth, and I need you to listen, because it's the only thing I can give you that might keep some of you alive." He leaned close to the gap, and he dropped his voice to almost nothing, and he gave us our 3 rules, and I have heard those 3 rules in my sleep every night for the rest of my life. "Don't look the chief in the eyes," he said. "Not ever. To them it's a claim. It means you think you're his equal, that you have the right to be judged as a person and not a thing, and that's the one thing that turns patience into cruelty. Keep your eyes down. Don't ask for mercy. They don't have the concept the way you mean it. To them, asking for mercy is asking to escape the balance, and the balance is the only sacred thing. A man who accepts his judgment is treated as a man. A man who begs is treated as an animal that's broken, and they put down broken animals differently. And whatever they give you to drink in the yard, not this is mine, this is real, whatever they hand you out there in the ceremonies, in the cups of bone and horn, pretend to swallow. Hold it in your mouth. Spit it when you can. It opens you. It makes the long things bearable for them to do and unbearable for you to forget." He pulled back from the gap. "What are they going to do to us?" Liam asked, and his voice was so young. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Behind him the bone fence rattled in the wind, and a dog that wasn't all dog walked past, and turned its head to look at us with eyes that caught the firelight and held it. "You killed the Bloodcrest," Elias said. "You flew where the sky belongs to it, and you killed it. To them, that's not poaching. It's not even murder. It's the end of the world made small. You put out the eye their God sees the forest through. The balance between the sky and the land and the animals and the people, all of it runs through that bird, and you broke it." He looked at us with something almost like pity. "They're not deciding whether to punish you. That was decided the second Dean pulled the trigger. They're deciding how. Each of you. One at a time. They'll take as long as they need to get it right, because to them, getting it right is everything. It has to match. The punishment has to match the sin." "How long?" Owen said. "As long as it takes," Elias said. There's a great ceremony coming. The night of returning wings. It's their highest rite. It comes when the winter constellation they call the wing rises full. Most of it will happen before then. He stood. The tribesmen shifted, ready to take him away. Drink the broth. Keep your eyes down. And listen to me carefully, all of you, because this is the truest thing I know about this place. He waited until we were all looking at him. They will not lie to you, he said. Whatever else they do, they believe completely. There's no trick here, no bluff, nothing to outsmart. That's what makes it so much worse than men who hate you. Men who hate you can be reasoned with. These people don't hate you at all. They're just certain. And then they took him away, and the door was barred, and the long judgment began. Act 5, the sentences. I'm going to tell you how they were judged. I've put it off in the telling the way I put off sleep, because to tell it I have to be back there, and there is no part of me that wants to be back there. But I promised precision, and the precision is the only thing that makes it mean anything instead of just being horror for its own sake. So I'll give it to you the way it came to us, slowly, one at a time, each one fitted to its man like a key to a lock. Understand that we couldn't see most of it. That's the thing people get wrong when I try to tell them. They imagine an arena, a spectacle. It wasn't. We were in our cells, in the dark, and what the tribe gave us was not sight. It was sound. They wanted us to hear and to wait and to imagine, because the imagining is worse than any seeing, and they knew that because they had done this many times before. Victor. They took Victor first, because Victor was the will of it, the leader, the one whose money had bought every other man's silence, including mine. Elias told us later that to the tribe, Victor wasn't the worst sinner. That was an honor they reserved for others, but he was the source, the spring the poison flowed from. And so he went first, so the others would understand that even the head of the thing was nothing here. We heard them take him from his cell across the yard at dawn. We heard him do the thing Elias had warned us against, heard him shout, heard him bargain, heard the words money, and whatever you want, and do you know who I am, go out into that cold yard and come back as nothing. He used his voice the way he'd used it his whole life, as a tool that had always worked, and it did not work, and you could hear in his voice the exact moment he understood that it would never work again, and that moment was the beginning of his real punishment, before they had touched him at all. They put him in the hanging cage. I saw that part through the gaps. They raised the human-sized cage of bent wood up onto its platform of poles with Victor folded inside it, and they left him there, swinging slightly above the stained snow, in full view of the shrine and the empty sky he'd flown through. And for a day and a night they simply left him, fed him nothing, said nothing to him. Let the cold work and the swinging work and the silence work. Let the great arrogant man hang in a basket of sticks over the eye of their god and contemplate what he had done. By the second morning his shouting had stopped. By the second night it had been replaced by something worse, a low continuous murmur, a man talking to himself, the sound of a mind starting to come apart. On the third day they brought the snake. At first Victor laughed. That was the part that made it worse. Not because he found anything funny, but because some last civilized piece of him still believed this was a performance with rules he understood. A rich man's laugh, a boardroom laugh, a laugh meant to make servants uncomfortable. Then the cage shifted. We heard the dry slide of scales against bent wood. Victor stopped laughing. For a while there was only the cage creaking in the wind, and that other sound inside it, soft and patient, moving where there was no room to move. Victor began to breathe loudly. Then he began speaking to it. Not to the tribe. Not to us. Not to God. To the thing in the cage with him. No, he said. No, no, no. Stay there. Stay there. The snake did not hurry. That was what broke him. Not the bite. Not at first. The waiting. The knowledge that there was nowhere in that little hanging prison where his body did not belong partly to the creature now. When he finally screamed, the dogs beneath the cage did not bark. They only lifted their heads. The cage swung for a long time after Victor stopped. A long white snake, kept somewhere warm in the smoke huts, sacred to them, a creature of the deep cold places. Elias told us later they had passed it up through the bars of the cage with Victor, into that small swinging space he could not get out of and could not get away from. Then they walked away again and left the two of them alone together. I will not pretend I understand snakes that live where snakes should not be able to live. I only know what we heard, across the yard, through 3 days. The silence, broken by a sound, by Victor's voice climbing into a register I didn't know a grown man's voice could reach. The cage swinging harder. And then eventually, after a length of time I refused to measure, the cage swinging gently again, and the murmur gone, and only the wind in the bone fence, and Elias coming to our door that night with his face the color of ash, and saying only, "Don't ask. Keep your eyes down. He's not the worst of it, and you need to save your strength." Victor wanted to mount a rare and beautiful thing in a cage on his wall, and look at it for the rest of his life. They put him in a cage, and gave him a rare and beautiful thing to share it with, and that was the match. That was the key in the lock. The punishment fit the sin so exactly that even in my terror some animal part of me recognized the awful symmetry of it, and was afraid in a new way, afraid of how right it was. Owen they took on the 4th day, and Owen's sin was that he wouldn't stop trying to fix things. He'd been working at the timber of our cell when they weren't watching, with a sliver of metal he'd hidden in his boot since the crash, a fragment of the radio's casing, the only tool any of us had. He worked at the lashings and the chinking with the patient, hopeless persistence that was the best thing about him, and I should have stopped him, and I didn't, because some part of me wanted to believe in the fixing too. They found the tool. Of course they found it. Elias said the dogs smelled the metal on his hands. And Elias said the tribe had a particular contempt. No, that's wrong. They didn't have contempt. I keep reaching for the wrong words. They had a particular answer for a man who tried to engineer his way out of a judgment, because to them the judgment was sacred, and a man who tried to break out of it was committing the original sin all over again, trying to escape the balance. They put Owen in the pit. We watched them lift the heavy-weighted lid off one of the covered pits in the yard, and we watched them lower Owen down into it, and Owen didn't shout. Owen had listened to Elias. Owen kept his eyes down and went quietly, and I think that quiet dignity is the only thing I can hold on to about Owen's end. They lowered him in, and then they set the heavy wooden lid back over the pit, and weighted it with stones and walked away. And then, slowly, the pit began to fill with water. Elias explained it after, in his flat, exhausted way, the way you'd explain plumbing. The pits were dug down to where a spring moved under the frozen ground, and they could be opened to it or sealed from it. And when they opened it, the water came up cold and slow, snowmelt cold, the cold that stops a heart, and it came up at the pace of a thing that has all the time in the world, an inch in an hour, and there was nothing in that sealed dark for the man inside to do but feel it rise. We heard him through the rest of that day and into the night. It started with the knocking. Owen, in the dark under the lid, knocking on the wood. Not panicked at first, methodical, Owen like testing, looking for the weak point, because that was who he was looking for the seam to fix even then. Knock, 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 steady, hopeful even. And we knocked back from our cell, because what else could we do? And across the yard the others knocked too, all of us trapped in our own boxes knocking to a man in his, a whole settlement of the condemned tapping on wood in the dark, and the tribe let us because the tribe wanted us to. The knocking changed as the water rose. It got higher up the lid, then it got faster, then it lost its method and became just pounding, and then there was his voice through the wood and the water, and he was begging. He forgot Elias's rule. At the end, the cold took it out of him, begging the lid, begging us, begging the spring itself to stop, and we knocked back harder as if our knocking were words, as if it meant we hear you, you are not alone in the dark, which was the only true thing left to say, and which helped. Nothing at all. And then the begging started gurgling. And then it stopped. And the knocking stopped. And there was a long time, I don't know how long, where we kept knocking anyway, refusing to be the ones who stopped first. And then one by one we stopped, and the yard was quiet except for the bone fence. And somewhere under the weighted lid in the cold dark Owen was floating, and he had fixed nothing, and he had wanted so badly to fix something, and the forest had let him knock until the very end, as if it were considering letting him out. It was never going to let him out. That's the cruelty I can't forgive even now, even understanding the logic of it. It let him hope, because hope was part of the sentence. A man who tries to fix his way out is sentenced to keep trying until the water takes the trying out of him. That was the night Liam stopped speaking for a while. He just held my arm in the dark and shook, and I held him, and I thought about the 8 years Owen and I had worked together, and I thought, I brought him here. The number Carl said, I said yes to it, And that's why Owen knocked in the dark. The guilt found a new room in me that night and moved in and has never left. Sabrina. Sabrina's they did differently, and Sabrina's is the one I hear most. She'd come for content, for attention. She had built a whole self out of being watched, out of turning every moment of her life into a thing performed for an audience, and the tribe, through Elias, who hated translating it, understood this about her with terrible clarity. They understood that the worst thing you could do to a woman who lived to be seen was to make her die unseen. Alone, in the dark, with only herself for an audience, and the audience dwindling. They didn't put Sabrina in a cage or a pit. On the 6th day, they took her out to the Red Antler boundary at the edge of the settlement, and they cut her. Not deeply, not to kill. Elias was very clear about this. The cuts were precise and shallow, and meant to bleed, meant to leave a trail. And then they did the thing that I think was the cruelest of all the cruel things in that place. Before they opened the boundary, Sabrina looked different. Not because of the blood, not because of the cold, because for the first time since I had met her, she was not performing. There was no little smile waiting for a lens, no angle in her face, no voice shaped for an audience. She looked small and young, and very far from every screen that had ever loved her. "They're going to film this, aren't they?" she whispered. No one answered. Her phone was tied around her neck with a strip of hide, hanging against her chest like a cruel necklace. Its screen was cracked but still glowing. Someone had turned the camera on. Sabrina looked at Elias. "Tell them not to," she said. Elias's face tightened. "They won't watch it," he said. That was when I understood. The recording was not for them. It was for her. For us. For whoever found it later. The tribe had understood the shape of her sin perfectly. She had spent her life turning fear into something other people consumed. Now fear would be the last thing she made. They let her go. They opened the boundary, and they stood back, and they let Sabrina Cole run out into the open winter forest, wounded and bleeding free. Free is the wrong word. There's no word. They let her run into a country that goes on for 1,000 kilometers in every direction with nothing in it but cold and trees, and the things that live in the cold and the trees, with a trail of her own blood unspooling behind her in the snow, and they let the dogs that weren't all dogs, and the wolves the dogs ran with take their time. They didn't chase her. They didn't need to. They knew the country. They knew what a blood trail does in that country. They simply released her into the logic of the place, and let the place do the rest, the way they'd let the spring do it to Owen, the way the cage did it to Victor. We heard it through the long 6th night. She had her phone. I don't know how she still had her phone. Maybe they left it with her on purpose. Maybe they understood even that. And in the open quiet of that frozen country, sound carries for miles. And so we heard from our cells, very far away and getting farther, her running. Her breathing, ragged and terrified, the breath of someone who has understood that the running is not toward anything. It's only away, and away has no end. We heard her calling out. Not words, mostly just sound. The sound a person makes into a dark that they have finally understood is empty. We heard her voice for a long time, getting fainter, and then we heard, far off, the other sound. The thick guttural panting. Many throats, moving without hurry. And we heard her hear it. And then there was a stretch of quiet. And then there was a single sound, short, and then there was nothing, and the nothing was the worst sound of the whole night, because it went on, and we kept listening into it for her, and she was not there. They found her phone weeks later. I know because the investigators told me, when I tried to explain what had happened, and they looked at me the way you look at a man whose mind is gone. There was a final recording on it. They wouldn't let me hear it. They said it was just wind and breathing, and, at the very end, before the recording cut off, her voice, very quiet and very calm, saying something they couldn't make out. I've thought about what it might have been every day since. I think, and I have no way to know this, it's just the thing I've decided to believe so I can stand it. I think at the end she stopped performing. I think for the first and last time in her life, she said something into a camera that wasn't for an audience. That was just for herself. And I think the forest let her have that, the one true private moment, right before it took everything else. A woman who could not bear to be unwatched was made to die in the most watched country on earth, watched by everything except a single human being who could have helped her. That was the match. Neil. Niels was the quiet one, and I've come to think it was the most patient and the most terrible of all of them, because there was no spectacle in it at all. There was only sound and time, and us made to listen. Neil Foster had forged the papers. He'd built the lie out of words and stamps and invented authorities, a whole false reality dense enough to fool a government, and he'd done it from a warm office, and he'd never once imagined it leading anywhere cold. The tribe understood Neil too, through Elias, who by this point in the translating had started to look like a dead man walking through his duties. They understood that Neil's sin was lies, that his whole life and his whole crime had been carried in words and paper, and that beneath the words, in the body, ran the thing that words come from, which is blood. And they decided his blood was full of lies, and they decided to let the lies out slowly, so he'd have time to feel them leave. They suspended him in one of the smoke huts, where the air was thick and warm and tasted of resin, and they made cuts, Elias said, at the wrists and the ankles, precise, ritual in a pattern, not to kill quickly but to open, and then they set vessels beneath him to catch what fell, and they did nothing else. They just let him drain, at the pace the body gives up its warmth and its lies. And they put the rest of us where we could hear. What I remember is the dripping. That's all it was for the first long while. A slow, steady dripping into the vessels, tap, 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 the most ordinary sound in the world, the sound of a leaking roof, of a tap not quite closed, except that we all knew what was dripping, and so the most ordinary sound in the world became the worst, and the tribe knew it would, because they understood that horror lives in the gap between an innocent sound and a terrible meaning. And Neil talked. For hours, while the dripping went on, Neil talked, and his voice got slowly weaker as the warmth left him, and what he talked about was the lies. He confessed. No one made him. There was no inquisitor, no question. The cold and the dripping and the slow leaving of himself simply opened him the way they'd opened his wrists, and out came everything, every forged document of his whole career, every false claim, every person he'd cheated, decades of it, pouring out of him in a voice that got fainter and fainter, the lies leaving him through his mouth as the blood left him through his wrists, both at the same patient pace, until I understood that this was exactly what they'd intended, that to them this was not torture but cleansing, that they believed they were helping him die clean, emptied of the false thing he'd filled his life with, and that the belief was sincere, and the sincerity was the most frightening part. His voice got down to a whisper, then to almost nothing. Then there was a long time when there was only the dripping, slowing, the gaps between drops getting longer, tap, 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 the rhythm of a thing running out. And then the gaps got so long that we couldn't tell anymore whether the next drop was coming, and we found ourselves waiting for it, the whole cell of us holding our breath waiting for the next drop. And that, God help me, that waiting for the sound of a man's blood is the single thing from that place I would most like to have cut out of my memory and cannot. There was no last drop that we could point to. There was just a silence that, after long enough, we understood had become permanent. A man who'd spent his life draining the truth out of the world had the lies drained out of him, slowly, while everyone he'd lied his way in beside was made to listen. The match. Always the match. The taking of pieces. It was somewhere in the middle of all this that they began to mark the ones they were going to let live. I didn't understand at the time that being marked was a kind of verdict, that the tribe had already decided, with whatever terrible calculus they used, that 4 of us were not to be killed but kept. Sent back. Made into something. I only knew that they came for us, the ones who were going to live, and that for us they had a different kind of judgment, one that didn't end us but stayed with us, so we'd carry the verdict out into the world in our own bodies. They came for Darren first. Darren the cameraman, who had never put the camera down, who'd filmed the crash and the cells and even in the dark, the sounds of the other's ends, the little red light always burning. The man who turned everything sacred or terrible into footage, into spectacle, into content for an audience that would gasp and click and move on. The tribe understood Darren the way they understood all of us, completely. They understood that he saw the world only through a frame, that he'd reduced their God and their grief and our deaths to images to be sold, and they decided that a man who used his sight that way had forfeited it. They took him into a smoke hut. There was smoke and ash and the sacred red feathers, and there was a long ritual we could hear but not see, low chanting and the crackle of green wood and Darren's voice rising and then breaking. When they brought him back to the cells, his eyes were bound in hide and packed with ash and feather, and when the binding came off days later, the eyes underneath were ruined, clouded, scarred. The golden color world he'd spent his life capturing reduced forever to gray and shadow. He would never see another image again. He, who had made his living from sight, would spend the rest of his life in the dark, with only sound, the very thing the tribe had used to punish all of us. A cameraman blinded by smoke and ash and the feathers of the bird he'd come to film. The match. For Marissa, the doctor, they took a hand. She brought it on herself, in a way, and it's the most human and the bravest thing anyone did in that place. When they had Grant down for the worst of his leg, when the infection had gone septic and his fever was killing him, and they'd come to do their own primitive work on it, Marissa fought to be allowed to help, fought to keep him alive, put her hands into the wound and the cold and the filth again and again, and in the doing of it her own hand was crushed in the rough rig they used, and then it froze, and then it went black, and there was no saving it in that place. Elias told me later that the tribe noticed what she'd done, that she'd used her hands to fight their judgment, to hold death back from a man they'd sentenced, and that they considered this, and that in the end they let her keep the verdict her own courage had written, took the dead hand at the wrist, and let her live. The healer, who'd used her hands to defy the balance, lost the hand. Even that they made into a match. For Grant, the soldier, it was the leg, and the leg was almost the gentlest of the verdicts, because it was the one the crash and the cold would have taken anyway. Grant, who believed every problem could be solved with force, who'd shouted at the treeline and bargained with no one and tried to fight a forest, the forest simply let his strength rot off him. The broken leg went bad and badder, until even Marissa with both hands couldn't have saved it, and they took it below the knee with a heat and a blade in the smoke hut while he screamed, and afterward Grant was quiet for the first time since I'd met him, a powerful man made to understand, in the one language he spoke, that there are things force cannot touch. And for me, they took an eye. I knew it was coming. I'd known, I think, since Elias told us the punishment had to match the sin, because I knew what my sin was. I'd seen. That was the whole of it. I'd seen the cases and known they were rifles. I'd seen Dean assemble the gun. I'd seen the bird and known it was sacred. I'd seen all of it, the entire lie, from the first 10 seconds in the mud room, and I had said nothing and done nothing because of a number a man named Carl had said to me. My sin was sight without action. The eye that sees and lets the wrong thing happen. They came for me near the end, and I did the thing Elias taught me. I kept my eyes down, I didn't beg, I held the drink they gave me in my mouth and spat it later into the dark. And when the chief himself came close, the chief I'd never once looked at directly, I felt him take my chin in a hard, cold hand and lift my face, and I knew I wasn't supposed to look, and I looked anyway just once, because I'm a man and I had to know what was deciding me. And his eyes were the most terrible thing I saw in all of Red Antler Preserve, more terrible than the cage or the pit, because there was nothing wrong with them at all. They were calm. They were kind, almost. They were completely, absolutely certain. The eyes of a man who has never in his life doubted that he was doing exactly what the world required, and looking into them I understood Elias's last warning all the way down. There was nothing here to outsmart, no hatred to appeal to, no bluff to call. Only certainty. They took the eye that had seen and not acted, and they left me the other, and I understand now why. They left me one eye so that I would go on seeing. That was the sentence. Not blindness. Darren got blindness, because Darren's sin was different. Mine was that I'd seen and stayed silent, and so my punishment was to keep seeing, forever, with one eye, to carry sight out of that place as a witness, to look at the rest of my life, and at every face that doesn't believe me, and to remember, always, exactly what I failed to see in time. A guide who saw the danger, and led his people into it anyway. Left with one eye to watch. The match. Liam. I have left Liam for last, the way I left him for last in my own mind for a long time, because Liam is the one I cannot make fit any logic, the one whose death had no clean symmetry, and I think that's the most honest and the most unbearable thing I can tell you about that place. That even in a world ruled entirely by matching, by symbol, by sin answered with sentence, the forest could still take a boy who was close to innocent, for no reason that I have ever been able to find. Liam Cross was 24. He'd come because I asked him to. His sin, if you can call it that, was trust. He trusted me, and I led him into Red Antler Preserve, so really his sin was mine, and I have spent a long time wondering if that's why it happened the way it did, if the forest took Liam to complete my sentence rather than his, if his death was just one more thing the eye they left me was meant to keep seeing. It happened near the end, the night before the great ceremony, when they came to take Marissa for the thing they did to Grant's leg. She fought the way I told you, and in the chaos and the smoke a tribesman raised a heavy thing. I don't even know what it was, a maul, a club. I never saw it clearly, over the doctor's bowed head, and Liam moved. That's all. He moved. He put his young body between the weapon and Marissa, not with any plan, not heroically the way it happens in stories, just the simple animal reflex of a decent boy who couldn't watch one more person be hurt and had reached the end of what he could bear. The blow that was meant to control Marissa caught Liam across the skull instead. He didn't die right away. That's the part one can't put down. He went down into the snow and the smoke, and I got to him, and Marissa got to him with her one good hand, and there was nothing either of us could do, and the tribe, and this is the only mercy I ever saw them show, and I don't know what it meant. The tribe stood back and let us hold him while he went. They didn't take him for a ritual. They didn't make a symbol of him. I think, looking back, that they understood he hadn't been theirs to judge, that he'd stepped into a sentence meant for someone else, and that even their terrible certainty had no answer for that, and so they simply let it be a death, a plain death, a thing that happened, and they let us grieve it like human beings, which we had not been allowed to do for any of the others. Liam looked up at me at the end, and his eyes were clear for a moment, and he was 24 and frightened, and he didn't ask me any of the questions I deserved to be asked. He didn't ask why I'd brought him. He didn't ask why I'd taken the money. He just looked at me, the way he'd looked at me on his first hunt when he was a boy, and the wolves had sung, and he'd been afraid, and I'd told him it was all right. "Is it all right, Caleb?" he said. And I lied to him one last time, the only good lie I've ever told, the lie I would tell again 1,000 times. "It's all right," I said. "I've got you. It's all right." And he believed me, because he always believed me, and he closed his eyes, and the smoke moved over us, and the boy who was the heart of us was gone, and outside in the yard the dogs that weren't all dogs began to howl, all of them at once, for the first and only time, a long rising sound that I have never been able to decide was grief or hunger, or simply the forest marking that the count was nearly complete. 7 were dead. 4 of us were left, marked, kept, judged, and waiting to be sent back. And the night of returning wings was 1 day away. Act 6. The Night of Returning Wings. Elias came to us on the last day, and he came with a plan, and he came having decided something about himself, though I didn't understand what until the very end. "The ceremony's tonight," he said, low, fast, the tribesmen who usually shadowed him gone for once, pulled away by the preparations. "The whole settlement will be at the shrine. The wings full in the sky. They'll be occupied. It's the only night in the year the dogs are penned and the boundaries unwatched, because on the night of returning wings nothing is supposed to want to leave. It's the holiest night. To run on this night is the deepest blasphemy there is." He looked at us, the 4 of us, the leftover 4. "Which is exactly why it's the only night you can." "Why are you helping us?" Marissa asked. Her wrist was bound, her face gray, but her eyes were still a doctor's eyes, still reading everything. "You've been here 9 years. You have a—" She stopped. We'd all seen them by now. The woman with the chief's bearing, who looked at Elias the way wives look at husbands. The 2 small children, antler-marked already, who ran in the yard. "You have a family here." Something crossed Elias's face that I've never had a word for. "I have a wife," he said. "Naya, the chief's daughter. I have 2 children who were born in this place and have never known another, whose names are in their language, who belong to this snow in a way I will never belong to anything again." He swallowed. "That's why I can't go with you. I want you to understand that before tonight, because tonight you might think I'm coming, and I'm not. My children are buried too deep in this place. I dug the holes myself, year by year, and I can't pull them out, and I won't leave them, and so this is the only country I have left." He looked away. "But I can open a door, and I can run the dogs the wrong way, and I can make it so that 4 of you walk out of here because somebody should. Somebody should walk out of every terrible place. That's the only thing I still believe in." Before he could tell us the route, a shadow moved behind him. For one terrified second, I thought it was a guard. Then the shadow stepped closer to the cell door, and I saw the woman from the yard. Naya, Elias's wife, the chief's daughter. She wore pale hide stitched with red thread, and her black hair was braided with small bones and feathers. I had seen her before near the shrine, standing with the stillness of someone everyone obeyed without needing to be told. She was not guarded. She did not need to be. Elias froze when he saw her. No one in the cell moved. Naya looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him, into the darkness where the four of us were crouched. Grant with his ruined leg, Marissa with her bandaged wrist, Darren with his blind eyes, and me with the hollow where my eye had been. She did not look angry. That made it worse. Anger would have meant there was still something human and simple left between them. But Naya looked at Elias the way someone looks at a door they always knew would open one day. She said something in their language. Elias closed his eyes. What did she say? Marissa whispered. Elias did not answer at first. Naya stepped closer and pressed a small bone charm into his hand. His fingers closed around it slowly, as if the charm hurt to touch. Then Elias finally translated, but his voice sounded far away. She says, I left her long before tonight. Naya reached up and touched his face once. Not gently, not cruelly, like she was memorizing the shape of a man who had already become a ghost. Then she turned and walked back toward the red light of the ceremony. She did not call the guards. She did not warn the chief. She let him choose. And somehow, that mercy looked more terrible than any punishment I had seen in that place. He told us the route. There was a frozen water channel, he said, a creek that ran under the Red Antler boundary at the low end of the settlement, frozen now, roofed over with ice and drifted snow, just wide enough and just tall enough for a person to crawl. It ran beneath the line of antlers that marked the world the tribe owned, and it came out, eventually, in open forest beyond the boundary, in country that was merely deadly instead of judged. If we could reach it during the ceremony and crawl it in the dark, we'd come out the other side, and then we'd only have the wilderness to kill us, which after Red Antler Preserve felt like a kindness. But the dogs were the problem, even penned, because a tribe that hunts with creatures that are half-wolf does not rely only on its eyes, and the moment we were missed, they'd run our scent, and a blood-scent trail in the snow ends the way Sabrina's ended. So Elias gave us the second part, the part that has stayed with me as the strangest and most intimate horror of the whole escape, because it required us to stop being people and become part of the forest. He gave us ash and cold wet mud he'd carried in, and a fistful of bitter crushed herb that stung the eyes, and a skin of old animal blood gone half to rot, and he made us cover ourselves in it. All of it. He made us rub the ash into our hair, and the mud into our skin, and the bitter herb into the creases of us, and smear the old rotted blood over all of it until we did not smell like ourselves, until we smelled like dead things and wood smoke and the floor of the forest, until our own scent, the human scent that the dogs were trained to find and follow, was buried under the smell of the country itself. Marissa with her one hand, working the foulness into Grant's stump and Darren's blinded face. Darren, who couldn't see, doing it by feel, methodical, calm, the most useful of us suddenly because the dark was his country now. Grant, who couldn't walk, dragging himself, refusing help past a certain point, a soldier again in the only way left to him. And me, with my one eye, looking at the three of them in the dark, the blind man, the one-handed woman, the legless soldier, and understanding that the forest had not chosen 4 whole people to send back as witnesses. It had chosen 4 broken ones, because a witness is more convincing the more clearly he has been marked. Because a man who walks out whole might be lying, but a man who walks out without an eye, a woman without a hand, they are evidence. They are testimony you can't argue with. The forest didn't spare us. It prepared us, and then it sent us, and that's a thing I didn't fully understand until much later, until the very last night of this story, when something stood at my window. But I'm getting ahead. The ceremony began at full dark. I thought I understood, by then, what fear was. I was wrong. The night of returning wings showed me a fear that wasn't about my own death at all. A fear that was closer to awe, the terrible kind, the kind the old books mean when they say the fear of God. The whole settlement gathered at the shrine of red feathers, and they lit fires, and they brought out drums made of stretched hide and horns made of bone, and they began. I won't pretend I understood the rite. Elias had told us only fragments, that it was the night they called the wings back, the night they renewed the balance, the night they reminded the sky that the forest still kept its covenant even though outsiders kept breaking it. The chanting rose and fell in waves. The fires threw the shadows of antler-crowned figures huge across the snow and the trees, so that the whole hollow seemed full of moving giants. And above it all, in the cold, clear sky, the constellation they called the wings stood out hard and bright, a great spread of stars that did, if you looked at it the way they must have, look like something opening across the dark. And then, I will swear to this until I die, and I know how it sounds, the birds came. In the deep middle of the night, at the height of the chanting, the air over the shrine filled with wings. White wings, red-tipped, gold-eyed, the bloodcrests, hundreds of them more, descending out of the winter dark to circle the fires and the feathered shrine, drawn by the rite or the drums or something older than either, and the tribe lifted their faces to them, and the chanting became something else, something that wasn't words anymore, a sound of pure joined feeling, and for one moment, watching through the gaps in our cell while we waited for Elias's signal, I forgot to be afraid and was only, I don't have the word, witness to something, something true, something that did not care about me at all and that I had no right to see, and that I will spend the rest of my life having seen. That was when Elias opened our door. We went out into the dark while the whole world was looking up. It was the longest 100 yards of my life. We moved low along the inside of the bone fence, away from the firelight, through the dark at the back of the settlement, and we moved at the pace of our slowest, which was Grant, dragging himself through the snow on his elbows and his one good knee, refusing the sledge we'd rigged until it became clear he'd kill us all with the time he was costing, and then accepting it with a soldier's curse, and Marissa and I pulling him while Darren came behind. And Darren saved us. The blind man saved us. Twice. The first time, I was about to lead us across an open stretch toward the low ground where the channel was, and Darren's hand closed hard on my arm in the dark, and he hissed, "Stop. Dogs. Left." And I froze and listened and heard nothing, nothing at all. And then, after a long moment, from the left, from the pens, the thick guttural panting of something that had woken and was testing the air. If we'd crossed when I wanted to, we'd have crossed right into its line of sight. We waited. It settled. Darren had heard it breathe before any of us could, because the dark was his now, because he'd been living in sound for days, and the punishment the forest gave him had become, on this one night, the thing that kept us alive. And I don't think that was an accident either, and I've stopped believing anything in that place was an accident. The second time was at the mouth of the channel itself, when a single figure, a guard or a straggler from the right, I never knew, came along the boundary near where we crouched, and Darren heard the snow under the figure's feet and pulled us all flat into the drift, and we lay there, for broken people smeared in ash and rot and old blood, not breathing, while a tribesman passed close enough that I could have touched his leg, and his eyes went right over us, because we did not smell like people and we did not move like people, and in the dark we were just one more dark shape on the floor of a forest full of dark shapes. He passed. He was gone, and we breathed. The channel was exactly as Elias had described it, and far worse than I'd imagined. A black throat in the snow, barely wide enough, the ice slick beneath and the frozen roof close above, and we went into it one at a time on our bellies, into a cold and a dark and a closeness that was its own kind of grave, and we crawled. Grant first, because if Grant got stuck we'd all die behind him, and we needed to know early. Then Darren, for whom the total dark of the channel was no different from anywhere else, and who moved through it more steadily than any of us. Then Marissa, one-handed, dragging herself by her elbows and her ruined wrist, not making a sound. Then me last, with my one eye, which was no use at all in that perfect black, so that I crawled it blind too, the way Darren lived now, and I thought about that, crawling, I thought, this is what you took the eye for. So I'd know. So I'd understand from the inside what it is to move through the world in the dark, trusting sounds and hands. How long the channel was I can't tell you. There is no time in a place like that. There was only the cold of the ice through my clothes, and the close press of the frozen roof on my back, and the sound of Marissa's breathing ahead of me, and far behind us, faint and then fainter, the chanting of the night of returning wings, the drums, the joined voices, the whole great rite to call the wings home, growing distant as we crawled away under the very boundary of it. And then, behind us, the chanting changed. It broke. The smooth wave of it stuttered and cracked, and a different sound came into it, sharp and high, and I knew, the way you know a tone of voice across a room in a language you don't speak, that we'd been missed. That somewhere back there, on the holiest night of their year, the four kept ones had been found gone, and the blasphemy of it had torn through the ceremony like a shot. And then the dogs. Even penned, even on the forbidden night, the dogs were loosed, and we heard them, the panting become baying, a whole pack of throats coming awake and coming alive and coming our way. And then we heard something else over the dogs, a single human voice raised, calling in their language, calling the dogs, and the dogs baying turned and went and faded, going the wrong way, going away from the channel, going east while we crawled west, drawn off by a voice they knew and trusted, a voice that had lived among them for 9 years. Elias, running the dogs the wrong way, buying us the dark. He'd told us he would, and I'd half not believed him, and he did it, and I have to believe, I have chosen to believe, that he made it look like an accident, that he had a story ready, that he survived the night and went back to his Naya and his antler-marked children and lived out his strange half-prisoner life in the only country he had left. I have chosen to believe that, because the alternative is a thing I built a wall against a long time ago. But I heard his voice that one last time, calling the dogs away, and I'll tell you the truth, which is that under the calling, just for a second, in English low, not meant for the dogs at all but meant for us, meant to carry down the frozen channel to 4 people crawling away in the dark, I heard him say something else. 2 things. The first was, 4 of you can still leave. I can't. My children are buried too deep in this place. And the second, fainter, the last words of Elias Ward that any outside soul will ever hear, was, tell them I was still a man. A child's voice called after him from somewhere behind the dogs. I did not know the word. I did not know the language well enough. But I knew what a child sounds like when he is calling for his father. Elias faltered for half a second. Only half. Then he ran harder. And the dogs followed. And then there was only the dark and the ice and the cold and the distance, and we crawled. Act 7, The Boundary. We came out the far end of the channel into open forest in the gray before dawn, and we climbed out of the black throat one by one into a world that was merely freezing, merely vast, merely indifferent, and after Red Antler Preserve it felt like being born. But we were not free yet. The boundary was behind us, and the boundary, I learned in the last minutes of our time near that place, was not only a line of red antlers in the snow. It was a thing the tribe believed in completely, and what you believe completely you do not cross, and that belief was the last and strangest thing that saved us. Because they came after us. Of course they came. We could hear them as we struggled away through the deep snow, dragging Grant, half carrying Marissa, who was fading now, Darren keeping pace by sound. We could hear them gathering at the boundary behind us, the dogs and the antler-crowned figures, dark against the first light, a whole line of them strung along the red antlers at the edge of their world. And they stopped. They came to the line of red antlers, the whole pursuit of them, the dogs straining and the figures grim. And they stopped at the line, and they did not cross it. Not one of them. Not the dogs, not the hunters, not even, when he came, the chief himself, walking through his people to the very edge of the antlers to look across the open snow at the 4 broken things crawling away from him into the wilderness. Elias had told us this might happen, and I hadn't understood it. Now I did. The boundary wasn't a fence to keep us in. It was the edge of what they ruled, and beyond it lay a country they did not own and did not enter, the open world, the world of outsiders, and on the night of returning wings of all nights, to cross the boundary, to leave the land the wings had been called home to, that was a blasphemy even greater than our escape. We had been sentenced. We had been marked. And now, by crawling beyond the antlers, we had passed out of their jurisdiction into a world that was no longer theirs to judge, and they would not follow, because following would have unmade the very balance the whole long, terrible ritual existed to protect. So they stood at the line, and we stood at the edge of our strength 50 yards beyond it, in the gray dawn, and for a moment the 2 groups simply looked at each other across the snow. The tribe and the survivors, the judges and the judged, the forest and the witnesses it had made, and nobody moved. And then the chief raised his hand. He didn't point at me threateningly. There was no threat in it. He raised his hand slowly, and he pointed, across all that distance, at my face. At my eye, the one they'd left me. And he held it there, the gesture, calm and certain, and I understood it the way I'd understood everything in that place once it was too late. He was reminding me, "We left you that eye on purpose. It is ours. It sees for us now. Wherever you go, however far, you carry our seeing inside your own head, and you will see for the rest of your life exactly what we left you to see." It was not a threat to come after me. It was the opposite. It was a release that was also a sentence. "We don't need to follow you. We are already with you. We are in the eye." Then he lowered his hand, and he turned, and the whole line of them turned with him, the dogs and the figures and the red antlers seeming to recede into the dark trees. And the boundary was just a boundary, and the forest behind it closed up and was only forest, and they were gone as if they had never been, and we four were alone in the open winter with 1,000 kilometers of nothing between us and any human soul, and somehow, impossibly, that 1,000 kilometers of killing cold was the most hopeful thing I had felt in 2 weeks, because it belonged to no one, and it was going to try to kill us the honest way, the clean way, with cold and distance and chance. And after Red Antler Preserve I welcomed it like a friend. We crossed a frozen river that morning, the 4 of us, and we put it between ourselves and the place, and we walked and crawled and dragged each other west toward where the world was, and I will not tell you the long ordinary horror of those days, because it is a different story, and it is the kind of horror that has a hospital at the end of it instead of a shrine. Act 8, Witnesses. A trapper-spotter plane found us on the 4th day, 3 of us walking and Grant on the dragged sledge, 4 black and bloody figures stumbling across a frozen lake far from anywhere we should have been. And after that it was helicopters and warm blankets and morphine and questions, so many questions, and it is the questions that I want to end on, because the questions are the last turn of the knife. They saved what could be saved. Grant lost the leg, the rest of it, above the knee this time, clean, in an actual hospital, and he lived. And the last I heard of him, he doesn't talk about any of it, not to anyone, and drinks, and I don't blame him. Marissa lost the hand at the wrist, the dead frozen thing the forest had already claimed, and she lives, and she went back to medicine one-handed, and she is the only one of us I still speak to, because she is the only other person on earth who knows that I am not lying. And we don't talk about it either, we just call each other sometimes late, and say nothing much, and that nothing is the most comfort either of us will ever get. Darren remained blind. There was nothing any surgeon could do with what the smoke and the ash and the feathers had done. He who lived for images lives now in the dark, and he does not make content anymore, and there is a justice in that so exact that I can't look straight at it. And I kept my one eye, and I see with it, and that is the whole of my sentence, and it is a sentence I serve every waking hour. They sent search parties, of course, federal teams, into the restricted preserve, with the coordinates we could give them and the wreckage as an anchor. And here is the thing that means no one will ever fully believe me, the thing that I think the forest intended, the final cruelty and the final cunning of the whole judgment. They found almost nothing. They found the wreck of the beaver, what was left of it, scattered and snow-buried, with Dean's remains and Everett's, and that much they could explain. A doomed illegal flight, a crash, exposure, a tragedy. But of the settlement, of the red antlers and the bone fence and the shrine and the cages and the pits, of the tribe, of 9 years of Elias Ward, of any of it, they found nothing. No structures, no people, no prison. They flew the coordinates I bled out of my memory, and they walked the ground, and there was only forest, only snow, only the vast and different preserve, as if the whole place had folded itself back into the trees the moment we crossed the boundary, the way it had seemed to in the dawn. They did find 3 things. They told me about them carefully, watching my face, the way you tell things to a man you've decided is broken. They found red feathers, a scatter of them, on the snow, in a clearing that matched nothing else. They found small charms of bone and antler and braided hair, arranged in a pattern no one could explain, left, it seemed, deliberately. And they found, set upright on a burned and blackened stump in the center of that clearing, perfectly preserved, perfectly composed, as though it had been placed there an hour before, a single white bird with red-tipped wings and a crown of crimson and 2 open golden eyes. The Bloodcrest, Dean's bird, the dead god, set out deliberately where it would be found, the only proof they left, a proof that proved nothing, that an investigator wrote up as evidence of possible ritual activity by unknown persons inconclusive. And the file is open and will stay open, and no one will ever close it, and no one will ever fully believe the one-eyed guide who came stumbling out of restricted country with a story about a tribe that the forest swallowed. And I have made my peace with that, because I understand now that not being believed is part of it. A witness who is believed gets to put the thing down. A witness who is not believed has to carry it forever. They didn't want me to be able to put it down. That's the sentence. To see and to carry and to never be allowed to set it down. I would have lived the rest of my life that way, half believed, half mad in the eyes of everyone who heard me, and I'd half talked myself into thinking maybe I was mad. Maybe the eye and the cold and the morphine had built the whole thing. Maybe there'd never been a chief or a cage or an Elias Ward at all. And then, for months later, on a still night with new snow falling, I heard wings outside my window. I want to be careful here at the end, because this is the part that I have told no one until now. Not Marissa, not the investigators, no one, because it is the part that I cannot survive being doubted on. I heard wings. A heavy, soft, particular sound, wings folding, a body settling just outside the dark glass. And every hair on my body stood up the way it had on the plane, the exact same way, the animal knowing before the mind. And I got up out of my chair, and I crossed the room with my one eye, and I looked out into the falling snow. It was standing on the sill, white, red-tipped, a crown of crimson, two golden eyes, and the golden eyes were looking at me, into me, through the one eye I had left, calm and certain and patient, the same look the chief had given me, the same look the bird on the dead spruce had given the plane, the look of a thing that owns you and is in no hurry, that has all the time in the world, that has, in fact, already won. I didn't move. It didn't move. For a long time we simply looked at each other through the glass, the one-eyed man and the impossible bird, the witness and the thing he'd been made to witness, and the snow fell between the streetlight and the dark, and I understood, finally and completely, the truth of what had happened in Red Antler Preserve. Then it lowered its head, the way a bird does, and it set something down on the sill, careful, deliberate, the way they did everything, and it spread its wings. And for one instant the red tips flared exactly the way they had over the dead spruce. Blood or feathers, you can't tell, you can never tell. And it was gone up into the falling snow, and the wing beat faded, and the night was just a night. I waited until morning to open the window, because I was afraid, and in the gray light I reached out onto the snow-covered sill, and I picked up the thing it had left. It was a necklace, a cord of braided sinew, and strung on it, a single small bone, smooth old, the kind of charm I'd seen hanging in the bone fence and around the necks of the antler-crowned figures. And braided into the cord with the sinew, unmistakable, gone gray, was human hair. I knew the necklace. I'd seen it 9 years' worth of weathered around a paler neck, on a man who'd told us not to look the chief in the eyes, who'd run the dogs the wrong way, who'd said tell them I was still a man. It was Elias Ward's, and so I knew that he hadn't survived the night, that his story hadn't held, that he'd run the dogs away from us knowing what it would cost, and it had cost him everything, and the tribe had judged him too, in the end, the man who opened the door, and the forest had taken his necklace and kept it for 4 months and then sent it to me, by the only messenger it has, across hundreds of kilometers of country no human can cross in winter, to be set on my windowsill in the falling snow. Because the forest wanted me to know. That's the thing I finally understood, holding that necklace in the gray morning. The forest didn't let 4 of us escape. It doesn't let anything happen by accident. I'd learned that much. It sent us, 4 broken witnesses, marked unmistakably, a man without an eye, a woman without a hand, a man without sight, a man without a leg, sent back out into the world of outsiders to be the proof and the warning, to carry the judgment of Red Antler Preserve out past the boundary the tribe themselves would not cross. We weren't survivors. We were the verdict delivered. And 4 months later it sent the last piece of evidence, the necklace of the man who helped us, so that the record would be complete, so that the one of us it had marked to remember everything would have no door left to doubt through. Because a dead body proves only that someone died. But a witness, a living, broken, half-believed witness, a witness carries the thing forward, into rooms the forest will never see, into years the snow will never reach, repeating it, unable to set it down, spreading the knowledge of what waits past the red antlers to everyone who'll listen and everyone who won't. I used to think we escaped Red Antler Preserve, but now I know the truth. The forest let 4 of us leave, not because we survived, not as mercy. It let us leave because witnesses travel farther than bodies, and the forest wanted to be remembered, and remembering is the one thing a dead man can't do. The forest did not spare us. It sent us back, and somewhere out there, beyond a line of red antlers in the snow, on the holiest night of a year I'll never see again, the wings are still being called home, and there is a creature, white and red and gold, that knows my name, and knows my window, and knows that I have one eye left with which to keep seeing, for as long as it decides I should see. I keep the curtains closed now. It doesn't matter. I can still hear the wings.